to Embodied Love Lounge. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, orgasm and beyond. What else is there?
What do you mean by beyond?
Well, we'll find out. So first, I want to jump in right away. Let's just define what we currently know as a majority around the big O.
Well, actually, I like sort of, if you're just to go, what is the most basic definition that we have of orgasm, which is what most people kind of explain as their experience of it, would be that it is maybe like 8 to 12 contractions of like across the pelvic floor that happen involuntarily, and they're about less than a second apart, and then as that orgasm continues, the separation of those contractions become longer and longer in between. And this is actually a definition from Nicole Prouse, who interestingly enough also says that a lot of the good stuff that happens isn't during just that physical reflex of the contractions of the pelvic floor, but actually all that pleasure, the heightened state of arousal just leading up to and just before it.
Yeah, I really like that part of her research because it's really emphasizing one thing that I really love is relaxed arousal. And so we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about typical orgasms, and then we're going to talk about what's beyond, and not necessarily beyond orgasm, but beyond our current definition of orgasm, into some realms and ideas that might feel kind of extraordinary or way out there, but we're going to share our direct experience, both in our own bodies, but also the bodies of people that we've coached, and just making sure that we can broaden possibility. Because I want to do this because when I was quite young, I believe 12, I started to have full body and ejaculatory orgasms on my own. I didn't know what they were. I was trying to find out. And here's a kid at that time, there was no like having a cell phone, Googling things.
No jump on the internet and do a little Google search.
No. And so all I had was the library and going to look at encyclopedias. And I looked up orgasm, and the definition in there, I went, oh, that's not me. Therefore I'm not having an orgasm. So unfortunately, the definitions that are out there for some of you may be such that you're like, oh, I that's not for me, or I don't have that kind of sensation. Therefore, it's not possible for me. And I think that's actually harmful. So I want to clear the air. I want to open up the landscape. Let's dive in first with typical things of what we go for. And then in this free portion of the podcast, we'll also look at what we were talking about, depth. And what was the other aspect? Depth?
And the state.
And the state. That's right, orgasm states.
So kind of the back up again. If we normally have certain standards by which we evaluate an experience as being good or bad. And in the same way, we do that with orgasms. And typically the things that we'll look at is like, okay, was it a good orgasm or not? Was how hard did we come? So like the intensity of the muscle contractions, the amount of muscle contractions, and the length of time over which it happened.
Yeah, so, and the frequency, meaning how often in your week.
Yeah, and how easily can you attain it, and how many did you get?
Yeah, exactly. How much work is it to get there, you know?
To achieve this mythical fraction of, and also it's, when looking at the time of it, we're also normally thinking that it's a kind of a rather fleeting experience for the amount of effort that we kind of put into it.
And are we going to include the orgasm gap in this conversation?
Yeah, we can definitely include the orgasm gap. Well, we'll show them what that is.
Okay, well, typically it's said that most people with a penis, men, will orgasm
between 5 to 7 minutes,
yeah, but almost every time that they stimulate. Whereas for the female body, it could happen. It's random. It definitely does not happen every time, and for some, never.
Yes.
So there's a big gap. And why is there a gap? So we'll have a look at that as well.
And specifically, it's between heterosexual men and heterosexual women that gap
is the biggest,
is the largest.
Yes. So with gay men, less so, because they're both male, so they can make each other come fairly easily.
And with lesbian women.
And with lesbian women,
they're so.
Yeah, even less so, they're more successful at inducing the pleasure. So there's something about bringing different style bodies together. There's a gap, and I think that's because we're informed by pornography for the most part, and that is not geared towards female orgasm.
Yes. And also I'd say too that there's one other kind of thing that we evaluate orgasms off of, and that's types. You have like the clitoral orgasm, and you have different types of internal orgasm. Most people will kind of start to list off, is it cervical, is it A spot, is it G spot, is it P spot, is it, all these different spots and places and triggers and buttons.
For me,
to
it's
push.
just fun. I think it should just, at the end of the day, be something enjoyable that doesn't come with a lot of anxiety and stress.
Well, maybe then we could kind of start there. You had mentioned before that when you were 12 and you read that definition of an orgasm, you go, that's not what I'm experiencing. Now, over your life now, which is more than just 12 years and lots of experience, you've been able to have kind of maybe things that were more similar to that definition, less similar. So I think it'd be interesting to just having your own personal experience. Tell us a little bit about, well, what does that typical definition orgasm that I gave at the beginning feel like?
Yes.
And what are some of the other possibilities that you can start to feel?
Okay, well, this is not the explicit portion, so
No.
I can't get too graphic here. But I will in the second half of the podcast. But just as a basic,
just to go over some of the standard
just
ones.
as a basic, the definition that was given, to me, I relate that to a clitoral orgasm.
Okay.
So it has a definite beginning, a middle, and an end. It's more like a peak experience. And there is for sure this sensation of contraction in the pelvic area.
Yes, it's quite localized.
It's localized, yeah.
And it's
Can be strong.
not just like just a pulse. It's like almost like you're having a muscle spasm.
It can be at times, yeah, quite strong that way. And whereas my favorite way of experiencing orgasm is not like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, so then the clitoral orgasm, it has that intensity. It's more localized. Also, I think another thing to point out too is typically at the end of it, it can really require a pause. Sometimes you can even feel like you're overstimulated or like don't touch here or I can't move at all. Now, what then would be some of the differences that you've experienced with, let's talk about some of these other kind of orgasms then. Like for instance, like something that would be kind of your more typical G spot or A spot. And in the next section, we'll get into why some of these labels can maybe just be let go of in terms of the types. But
well, then I'm just going to refer, there's clitoral, which is external, and then there's internal.
Yeah.
So there's a big difference for me. I've learned over the years what that difference is, but as a texture, as an experience, when it's an internally induced orgasm, then there can be more depth of emotion. There can be more of wave-like pulsations through the whole body and a sense of relaxation and coming home and less kind of uptightness. If I want to fall asleep, it's the clitoral orgasm I'll go for, because that's a little very quickie, within 10 to 30 seconds, wee, and then, get to sleep. So, but if I'm wanting to connect and really provide relaxation in the nervous system, in my psyche, if I've been stressed about a lot of things, I'm going to go for the deeper or like internally induced orgasms, because it resets my psychology. It resets how I feel about things.
so that's another important difference, and that maybe people could identify, forgetting where they're touching or like the technique or what to label it, is, well, what is the energetic after effect of when stimulating? So you're saying that clitoris stimulating externally, more often than not for you, it's they kind of like get a big burst of energy drops, fall asleep, you're good.
That can be like that for sure.
And what is it like then with the other types of orgasm, internal?
Well, I go into a deeper state of relaxed arousal, so there's nourishment or rejuvenation, a sense of that, and a deepening of connection. I kind of remember, I actually have intimacy here with myself. I'm not just this walking head that's going through all these tasks in my life. And it brings me back to the beauty of the moment. So it has those qualities.
Okay. And what I'm sort of hearing is, would you say it's sort of the difference between getting put back in touch with your body because someone starts to tickle you, and then you're like, okay, that's too much stimulation, stop. But it's quite sensational, versus going to get a massage,
like slowly defrosting,
relaxing into it.
Yeah.
But then at the end of it, yes, you're very relaxed, but you also feel energized in a different way. Yeah, you still might fall asleep, you still might even feel very stimulated, but you're not in this kind of hyper alert, overstimulated state.
Yeah, I think when I was studying more the Taoist side of sexuality, they really look at peak and valley orgasms. And so the clitoral orgasm in their language would be considered yang. So it's like fireworks, it's explosive. It usually you feel a rush moving from the pelvis up. So that there can be like this kind of feeling. And with the more yin or valley orgasm, you don't really have a peak experience, but you feel like it's extended or expanded. You might be floating, or it's hard to describe because everyone has it differently. However, it does feel different from each other. So I think if you're mapping it out, is there one that feels kind of peaky and strong and explosive, and is there one that feels more languid and flowy? It's still very deep, it's very strong, very profound, but it has an emotional quality. And I learned many years later that the pelvic nerve, when stimulated, which you can only access by going into the body, it's not accessible externally, that internal accessibility point, so deep in the vagina, that helps with confidence issues, creativity, helps you even access states of transcendence, which is why I think the associated cervical orgasms, there's been talk around it inducing psychedelic states, because we're talking about all these things today. So just throwing that out there, we'll come back to it. But the deep pelvic nerve stimulation, it has a grounded feeling. It has this feeling of maybe you need to release some emotional tension. So you might end up crying or laughing, or something will move through, and there's a greater sense of connection to self and life.
I think this is one of the important things to know, is that everything, all these pieces, are actually in quite close proximity to one another.
Yes.
And you almost can't stimulate one without stimulating the others.
Yes.
Because again, they're
you
all
can
connected.
You can definitely do it as a mapping process,
Yes.
though, because the nerves respond differently. They're all sending signals. Recently, I was looking at something super interesting where through the clitoris, the pudendal nerve, not only do you have signaling to the brain, which we all know because the brain is the biggest organ for orgasm, but there's a looping mechanism that keeps the signaling just in the sacral nerves and the sacrum. So you're just getting this instant feedback, which can create, if you're able to expand orgasm, so we can talk about that too, through breath, it creates this kind of expanded effect, or added layers effect. So it's not just one. So I think that's really curious that the nervous system both can give you the instant peak to the brain, but also that there is a very localized looping that can happen with sensation. And I have definitely experienced that with suction sex. So
it's almost like pleasure has its echo, or that
amplification.
It has its own resonant effect that it
I think the body just knows this is so good for me. And the reason it's so good, the primary reason pleasure is so important to the body, is nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is really needed for health and well-being. And it's only really produced in abundance when you're in a state of pleasure. And it goes away very quickly. So if you want your cells healthier, if you want fertility, if you want, I don't like the word anti-aging, but just longevity and youthfulness throughout life.
Health optimization.
Yeah, nitric oxide is a really, really important thing. If nitric oxide is not present, you can't fertilize an egg. So it's a really crucial part of being a human being. I think it's fascinating biologically that it's created by pleasure. It's the experience of the physical sensation of pleasure that induces this substance to be created. I think that's really amazing that we're wired that way. So if we're wired that way, and it's such a valuable and important part of our well-being, why are we not all studying pleasure very deeply and becoming more and more masterful of it?
I mean, it's a really interesting one, because a lot of the times, if I'm trying to help clients understand their pleasure, which there's just really no pleasure-based sex education out there. It's always about reproduction. It's about helping to, at best, and sometimes not even, to resolve dysfunction. You know, I have to draw on analogies of one type of pain versus another type of pain, so that people can then get a perspective like, oh, okay, well, this is one type of pleasure versus this type of pleasure, so that they know, okay, it's not that this type of pleasure is better or worse, but they have different textures to it. And you stated that you can have these kind of like psychedelic experiences around the cervix, and then these peak experiences with the clitoris, and then these kind of deeper emotional experiences. So what I want to get into and have you maybe speak a little bit about before we switch into the explicit part, just from a sensational perspective, what could you kind of walk through that range? I feel like there's kind of like this in-between place of like the blended orgasm.
Exactly.
What happens kind of like, because, okay, for instance, and I'll let you answer this in a second here. You had mentioned that with a clitoral orgasm, it becomes very explosive.
Yeah.
Whereas the internal orgasm can also be like take its time and build up more slowly. Well, I've also noticed that even with that, you can do quote unquote edging with the clitoris, where you start to take and make it extended and longer. You can also have something that happens very suddenly and explosively internally, but even then there's still a difference between that internal explosion and the internal explosion, or the slow languid outside. So maybe you can kind of just draw out that spectrum of the landscape from entrance to internal, in terms of like what kind of sensations happens and why you might want to learn about building it up slowly, or maybe why you would want to have this really intense explosions.
Okay.
It's a lot.
Yes. And then I think we'll switch to explicit, because it's really hard to not be explicit in these answers. First of all, the damage we do to the clitoris with vibration is sad, because if a person can learn to really sensitize the clitoris, it doesn't require a Black & Decker machine that just shakes it to the foundation. What that does to nerves is actually numbs them out. So it gets harder and harder and harder to have that experience.
That's why typically people want to buy a stronger vibrator and need to apply more pressure for a longer period of time.
And sometimes to the point where they hurt themselves, because they need so much almost pain in order to feel pleasure. So I just want to dial it back and say, if that's a scenario that's happening, which is really typical, like a large number of the women I see, that is their experience. And so taking a little vibrator holiday, starting to resensitize.
It's like the guy that uses the death grip. The only way that they can get pleasure is by like squeezing really hard.
Exactly. You just want to start understanding the mechanics of this beautiful part of your body that's, what now, over 10,000 nerve endings? I mean, every time they count, there seems to be more.
Well, and that study itself was actually from a cow that they used. I'm not sure how much it translates exactly.
It relates to human beings. So, but whatever the case, it's very sensitive. And
there's definitely a lot of nerve endings that are concentrated.
It's worth exploring all these areas that induce what we're calling orgasm, to explore them prior to the orgasm experience. And the reason I say that is, that edging that you were talking about is the thing that will help you start to define the different nuances and flavors and textures.
So edging is when you bring yourself close to an orgasm and stay at that edge there because of this height of pleasure without, quote unquote, going over the edge and entering into the refractory period.
Yeah. So, but to summarize, just because I want to switch over to the explicit. So the clitoris can feel like a momentary explosive experience. You can expand it by learning techniques of edging, and it does have this quality of like physical inducing physical
like
contraction,
throbbing,
throbbing, but also physical contractions in the actual experience of the release. In the blended orgasm, which is more like stimulating all around the urethral sponge, what you're
moving a little bit deeper, kind
what
of
you're
the
getting
G
is
spot.
where the pelvic nerve and the pudendal nerve cross over. So now you're going to get signaling to both the pelvic nerve and the pudendal nerve. So that's kind of interesting. When you can understand that you can access clitoral stimulation internally, it can revolutionize how a person feels about their body, because if they're thinking I can only have this and not that, it's actually not true. It's just that the area hasn't been sensitized.
Yeah, the majority of the clitoris is internal anyways.
So that can feel really interesting because it can be explosive but also deeply moving. So whenever there's an emotional quality, it's the pelvic nerve kind of frequency. And then the more explosive, almost like splashes of light or fireworks, that is more evocative of the pudendal nerve, a feedback loop. And then going all the way into the pelvic nerve, that can be, so what I mean by internal explosion, it's not like a firework. It would be like a tsunami.
Okay.
It starts, you're like, it kind of takes you off guard at times. And if you're not paying attention, by the time you're tuned in, the wave is pretty huge, and then it can really take you over.
Well, and I think this is the perfect place to transition, because whereas fireworks are this instantaneous burst that is, pop, 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 maybe
Very
3
exciting.
or 4 bangs, that really gets your attention. This metaphor of a tsunami of waves has 2 qualities I think are interesting. One is that the whole ocean floor has changed its state.
Yes.
Like there is a new state where these waves just keep coming, and there's a buildup of these waves, which I think is what I'm referring to as 2 qualities of orgasm that rarely get addressed, which is this orgasmic state when it starts to be prolonged over longer periods of time during, before, and after the sexual experience, but also depth, meaning that how do those waves build? So even though it's maybe one wave and the third wave are the same waves, but that third wave, the way it lands, is so much more powerful in terms of how it's experienced.
Because if you understand how tsunamis work, there's like the pre, and then there's the thing, and then there's the aftershock. So there's quite a lot going on there.
And the state of everything has changed after a tsunami.
I suppose the safest place in the world for a tsunami is like in the water.
Yeah.
Like a few miles offshore.
Yeah, because when you're farther out, there's only like this much.
A little bit of movement, yeah.
Movement,
But if you're on the shore,
levels,
it's like...
Well, because as it gets closer, that level builds.
Okay.
And I think that's the kind of analogy here, is that when you start to play with these nuances of your body and to experiment and be curious, you'll discover, these are the ways I can make tsunamis, tidal waves within my own body.
It makes me laugh too, because I remember, I used to live in Hawaii, so there's lots of tsunami warnings, and so that we had this huge tsunami. It was going to be devastating, and then all of a sudden there was nothing. It was literally like 1 inch of water came in. And so I was like, the 1 inch tsunami.
I feel a lot of people's experience of sex is like that. You need to wait till you're married. You have to be so important for your first one, and then you have this 1 inch tsunami experience, and you're like,